Morning, everyone. So today, I'm going to talk about a really specific project in the Arlington Heights neighborhood in Fort Worth that I worked on while I was at the city of Fort Worth. This is more information on the AIA credit. Make sure to sign in and put in your AIA number on the sign-in sheet before you guys can get credit. These are our learning objectives today for AIA continuing education. Number one is how to utilize federal regulatory processes to achieve local preservation objectives. Number two is how to craft municipal ordinances and administrative regulations to ensure protection of historic resources. Number three is creative solutions to mitigate flooding in historic districts. And number four is how to set the local preservation program up for success. So this is Fort Worth. That's Camp Bowie Boulevard on the bricks there in the middle. And Arlington Heights is to the right, and it's a little bit to the left, but mostly to the right. Can you guys hear me? Is that better? Okay. If you aren't familiar with Fort Worth, it's Arlington Heights is just west of downtown in the Museum District. It's bounded by Camp Bowie Boulevard to the north, I-30 to the south, and the Museum District and the New Dickies Arena to the east. So this neighborhood was built out in the 1920s and 30s, pre-World War II for the most part. It's got a great collection of Tudor homes and perhaps no bungalows, which you see here. But before, it was a cute little historic neighborhood. It was mainly open prairie. And when we think about flood mitigation, like many places in Texas, you don't have development and concrete and paving everywhere. The prairies, especially in Northeast Texas, do a great job of absorbing rain from floods and flood events. And the soil either absorbs it, or when it can't hold any more water, it's shed into creeks and water flow paths that then make its way into the various rivers throughout the state. Fort Worth, that's the Trinity River. And even after Fort Worth was founded in the 1840s, there really wasn't much development on the west side of downtown. It remained largely open farmland and ranch land. And the first major development that occurred in this area was in World War I, when the Army built Camp Bowie west of Fort Worth. And so this map over here on the right shows the layout of Camp Bowie. The Army actually left quite a bit of open space in this area because there were lots of creeks and drainage flow paths that flow through Camp Bowie and Arlington Heights south towards the Trinity. And you can see in this picture on the left, which is a photo of Camp Bowie, they left a lot of the native open prairie in and around the Army camp. Army did build out some infrastructure to support the base, such as streetcar lines, electrical lines, and water lines. What they didn't build out was sewer lines. You can see all the outhouses that line Camp Bowie in the photo, or storm sewer lines. So Camp Bowie existed for a couple of years, and then after World War I, it was dismantled. I think there's still maybe 2 buildings in Arlington Heights from Camp Bowie that exist today, but for the most part, the entire camp was taken down and shipped off. Shortly after the camp was dismantled, the land was opened up for development. So developers came in and parceled out all of the land that the camp used to sit on. They built in infrastructure that didn't exist when the camp was in operation, such as sewer systems, stormwater pipes. Most of the stormwater pipes were built in existing creek beds or water flow channels. And so this is a snapshot of Arlington Heights, a historic plat from that neighborhood that shows an old creek bed and water flow path through the neighborhood, but also the storm sewer pipe in red that was built in roughly the same area to help drain this new residential neighborhood that was built right after World War I. So in the 1920s and 30s, when there wasn't that much development in West Fort Worth, the storm drain system could handle large flood events, and the homes would not flood. But as more and more development spread out on the west side of Fort Worth, the ability for the soil to absorb water during storm events decreased, and flooding became an issue. And so by 1967, the city had identified this particular section of Arlington Heights as a flood hazard because, you know, within 40 years of the storm sewer system being built, it could no longer handle an average rain event. So fast forward to today, this shows the various water paths and water flow paths and drainage paths through Arlington Heights. You can see most of it goes south or east to the Trinity River. And this area in green is the area we're talking about in the Arlington Heights neighborhood. The flooding has gotten worse, mainly because for two reasons. There's been so much development on the west side of Fort Worth, and the storm events have gotten more intense. So we're getting more rain and larger storms every time we have a weather event come to Fort Worth. So these photos show flooding from a 100-year flood event, which is supposed to occur every 100 years, right? This section of Arlington Heights was getting 100-year flood events every 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And it got to the point where, you know, FEMA is the last resort for flood insurance for property owners. FEMA would no longer insure most of these properties. And so homeowners couldn't afford, without the FEMA funds, to repair their properties after they were flooded. Most of these houses are elevated about 18 to 24 inches because they're all on pier and beam foundations. They were still getting 2 to 3 feet of flood water every time there was a flood event. So finally in 2018, FEMA said, we will give the city of Fort Worth a grant to acquire the 2 properties that have flooded the most, or flood the worst, whichever way you want to look at it, which are these 2 properties in green on the screen on Western Avenue. And the city, at the same time, decided to undertake acquisition of 9 other properties adjacent to the 2 FEMA grant properties. And so the plan was FEMA funds were going to be used to buy 2 properties in green and demolish those homes. Because there was no way that FEMA was ever going to insure those properties anymore. Nobody was going to be able to buy them because they couldn't get a mortgage, because you have to have flood insurance to make sure that, you know, you can obtain a mortgage. And the city was going to buy and elevate or demolish the other 9 homes adjacent to the FEMA properties. Because FEMA funds were being used for 2 of the properties, we had to undergo a Section 106 review process. Right? Anytime there's federal funding that could affect eligible or designated historic resources, you have to do a Section 106 review to determine if there's an adverse effect on historic resources or eligible historic resources. And luckily, our 1980s Terracon County Historic Resources Survey had identified this section of Arlington Heights as a potential conservation district. But when the survey was done in the 1980s, this section of Arlington Heights was only about 50 to 60 years old. So it had just gotten past that point where it was an historic age, but the survey recommended that conservation districts needed more research and more background info to determine if they were eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And so because of this survey, we were able to leverage the resources that we had at the city to hire a consultant to undertake a reconnaissance level survey of the Hillcrest Conservation District, which is what you see here on this map. The blue is the boundary of the reconnaissance level survey. The red boundary with the green dots is the project area. And the orange boundary is actually a small 1-block local historic district called the Hillcrest Historic District. Excuse me. So the survey found that 1, this conservation district was eligible or is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And 2, that 9 of the 11 properties in the subject area were contributing resources. And so when you think about, including the 2 FEMA properties, and so when you think about the Section 106 process, if most of these properties that are in the project area are going to be demolished or elevated. That is usually considered an adverse effect under section 106. So you have to find a mitigation plan. You have to put together a mitigation plan to mitigate that adverse effect. For the two FEMA properties, it was just HABS level 3 documentation, which is the lowest level of documentation for HABS. So it's basic photographs of the inside and outside of the building, a floor plan, site plan, but no narrative history, nothing above and beyond, just basic documentation standards. And then those two properties were demolished. And so we had to ask ourselves, is this an ideal preservation outcome, right? I don't think so. I would say most of us in this room don't think so. Yes, it probably helped with stormwater mitigation because we no longer had a structure or pavement on site that would impede the flow of water through the district and the natural creek channel. And you open up more green space for the soil to absorb water during rain or flooding events. But we at the city had to figure out a better solution for the 9 other properties that weren't funded by a FEMA grant project. We also had to make sure that we were meeting our stormwater division's goals of mitigating flooding for this section of Arlington Heights. So what we did, we decided to leverage our preservation plan from 2003. Even though it was old, one of the key recommendations in that plan was that the city manager should create an administrative regulation that required review of all city-sponsored projects that could affect historic resources by the historic preservation officer. So anytime the Transportation and Public Works Department is doing a road repair or installing new curbs and gutters, or the Stormwater Division is upgrading stormwater infrastructure out near Lake Worth, we have to review that project administratively to make sure that there's not an adverse effect to historic resources. And because the city, through the Transportation Public Works Department, Stormwater Division was acquiring these 9 other properties, we had to review that to make sure that there would not be an adverse effect from the acquisition and either the demolition or elevation of those properties after they were acquired. So this is just a snapshot of what our administrative regulation A10 form looks like. This policy has been in place in Fort Worth since 2007. I would say about 98 to 99% of the projects we reviewed, there's no adverse effects, and it's pretty easy for us to work with all of the departments in Fort Worth to make sure that historic resources are protected. Every once in a while, we get a crazy project like this one at Arlington Heights where there is going to be an adverse effect. And so we have to do a lot of work to make sure that we find the best possible outcome for historic resources. So when we reviewed this project under our administrative regulation process, we found that, of course, there would be an adverse effect, not just on the properties themselves, but on the streetscape and the character and district of this potential historic district as a whole. So if you think about it, if all 9 of these properties plus the 2 FEMA properties were demolished to reduce flooding impacts, there'd be a huge hole in the middle of this historic district. And so you lose that integrity and you lose that concentration of historic resources. So we worked with our transportation, we worked with our stormwater division to put together a really detailed mitigation plan. And it's centered around 2 different paths. So path number 1 is the city would sell the properties to developers or new property owners. And those people could elevate the structures and save them. Path number 2 is the city sells the properties to developers and the developers tear them down and either leave them as open space or build a new house that's compatible on the site, but is raised above the minimum threshold for flooding. What we did was for path number 2, if the properties were going to be developed or demolished, we calculated a demolition fee that ranged from $30,000 to $40,000 per property. if that property was demolished, the Stormwater Division would transfer that fee into the Historic Preservation Program to fund future preservation activities throughout Fort Worth. If path number one was chosen and the developers decided to elevate the properties and save them, we put together a pretty detailed set of guidelines and standards to make sure that the elevated structures were still consistent with the historic character of not only the property, but the historic district. So we relied pretty heavily on the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, to make sure that, they weren't going to elevate them 20 feet in the air like you see in Galveston, right? We're going to have maybe 3 to 4 feet of elevation. It was going to be compatible with the structure. It wasn't going to destroy historic fabric. And it was going to be consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings. Luckily, at the same time, we were going through all of this. The National Park Service published their guidelines on flood adaptation in 2019. So we were able to utilize these as well, which have great visuals on how to elevate structures and prevent them from sustaining flood damage in the future. So this was a big help for us. It was a big help for our stormwater team because, not being preservationists, they were having a hard time understanding all like the granular standards and guidelines for rehabilitating structures. And then we put together a list of final mitigation options. And depending on what would happen, either Path A or Path B, if all 9 properties that the city acquired were demolished, a total of $421,100 would be transferred to the city's historic preservation fund. It is not the best preservation outcome for the structures of that neighborhood, but it would at least give us the funding to protect other resources throughout Fort Worth in the future. And the funding had to be used for 4 specific projects. One was documenting the historic structures before they were demolished. 2 was supporting the city's historic resources survey, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute. Number 3 is updating the city's historic preservation plan, which is now 22 years old. And number 4 was restoring Thomas Place Community Center in the center of Arlington Heights. This was actually the original school for the Arlington Heights neighborhood when it was built out. Most of the famous people in Fort Worth that you've heard about went to school here. But for some reason, they bricked in all of the original windows 40 or 50 years ago. So funding from this mitigation plan would be used to reinstate those original wood windows and fenestration pattern on both the front and back side of the building. Now, the reason this funding is so important is because when we compared our historic context, and thanks to our friends at HHM and Emily in the back for helping us with this, we mapped out all of the areas of Fort Worth that needed to be resurveyed because our survey was so old. We also put together a cost for what it would take to resurvey the entire city of Fort Worth. And it would take over 17 years and $1.2 million to resurvey the entire city. And that's just Fort Worth. That's not the rest of Terracon County, because of all of the historic age neighborhoods and districts that have passed that 50-year mark since the 1980s. Terracon County Historic Resources Survey. And so this mitigation funding from the Arlington Heights project would not only help us pay for at least half of it, but it would help us leverage grant funding to complete the full survey of Fort Worth over time through certified local grant funds from the Texas Historical Commission. And so we've embarked on this long range process. I think we're almost done with phase 2, which is years 2 through 6. So we're almost done resurveying all of our local historic districts. And starting, I guess, probably next cycle, we're going to start surveying areas that are not local historic districts and branch out to other parts of Fort Worth. And another reason why this funding from the mitigation plan is crucial is because we don't know if those CLG grant funds are going to be available in the future. CLG grant funds come from the Historic Preservation Fund, and they're allocated to state historic preservation offices throughout the country, like the Texas Historical Commission. As of today, funds that were allocated by Congress last year for fiscal year 25 still have not been transferred to SHPOs. So grant projects that have been approved for this year, like Fort Worth's update of its historic preservation plan, haven't been started yet because they don't know if the CLG grant funding is available. In addition, in the proposed budget for FY26 at the federal level, there are no funds allocated for those at all across the country. So when you think about projects like this historic resource survey or other preservation planning initiatives in your community, the funding that usually funds half of that project may not be able to be available next year or in future years to come. So on a side note, if you haven't talked to your council or council members, your local representatives, please give them a call. This is really important because a lot of what we do as preservationists throughout Texas is in jeopardy if these CLG grant funds aren't available in the future. So this project has been going on since at least 2018. Finally, about 2 months ago, Fort Worth City Council approved the sale of properties to new property owners. And so the actual process of either elevating and saving these homes or demolishing them is about to begin. I just heard last week from our historic preservation officer at Fort Worth, Willing, that one of the property owners has decided to move forward with demolition. And so their historic preservation fund is about to get an infusion of cash, but she doesn't know what's happening with the rest of the structures yet. So more news to come on that. This is a project that's probably going to stretch on for another 5 or 6 years. It's a really long range project. But at the end of the day, we're hoping that at least some of the structures will be saved and elevated. And those that aren't will be demolished and will have more open green space to absorb stormwater during rain events in the future. Our stormwater division has already noticed some benefits from those 2 properties that were demolished. It's reduced the amount of flooding during rain events because the soil is able to absorb more water, and the flood waters aren't pushed into neighboring properties because the houses that are there aren't blocking the flow of flood waters through that little creek bed down towards the Trinity. But this is what it looks like today. They actually demolished that. There was a house in the middle right there, so now there's 3 vacant lots. As you can see, there's a very large green space that's there to soak up water during rain events. And these are our lessons learned as city staff. Make sure you have a good preservation plan in your community, because if you do and you have a very specific set of goals and recommendations in that plan, you can leverage those to and creative and unique ways to protect historic resources throughout your city. Flood mitigation strategies and historic preservation initiatives are not diametrically opposed. You can accomplish both. Even if we saved all these structures, at the end of the day, they would be elevated, and it would help reduce the issues from flooding in Arlington Heights. You never know what kind of unique opportunities are going to come your way for the preservation program. So make sure that you're thinking creatively and leveraging the unique opportunities that come across your desk. And don't waste a good demolition. I know we can't always get the structures back after they're gone, but usually we're able to leverage demolitions to protect more historic resources further on down the road. And the big takeaway, or the last takeaway, is future preservation funds from the Texas Historical Commission and other SHPOs may not be available for these types of projects. And so if you work with your municipality, or you work for a municipality, it's really important that you start thinking and planning now for how you're going to fund your preservation projects and initiatives in the future. Because you're gonna have to get creative with your funding, and city councils are gonna have to allocate more funding for preservation initiatives in the future than they do right now. That's it. So for the two FEMA properties, the city owns those lands in perpetuity. And so they're never allowed to be redeveloped. And the city is responsible for mowing and maintaining them because of the stipulations in the FEMA grant. For the other properties, whether they're elevated or demolished, part of the deed of sale included deed restrictions that the new property owners have to abide by those standards and guidelines that we put together if they're elevating the structures or for new construction to make sure that it's compatible with the surrounding district. And so the city attorney's office would enforce those deed restrictions to make sure that what we all worked on as part of this project actually comes to fruition. If they're demolished, the property owners are responsible for upkeep and maintenance of the vacant land in the future. Well, that was another really complicated part of this project. Originally, when we first started talking to our stormwater division, they wanted to raise all 10 houses and turn it into a park. The neighborhood did not want a park because they didn't want loiterers or people hanging out right next to single-family homes in the middle of this neighborhood, and they were worried about maintenance of, extra vegetation other than just grass and a few trees. So ultimately, the stormwater team decided not to install a park with more plantings. They wanted to leave it more as open space, which was less maintenance costs for them down the road.
Sale, how did that work?
It was a lot of negotiation.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, what was the process of acquiring the properties? Was it eminent domain or voluntary acquisition? It was voluntary acquisition. So the city stormwater team went property by property and bought them one by one. I think it was usually at fair market value. I don't think they were constricted to appraised value, but it took. That's why this process has taken so long, as it took several years to actually acquire the properties. All of them. They didn't think the other 9 properties were that bad yet.
They were willing to raise
The two. Yeah, and their funding's limited too. They only have so many grant funds they can distribute each year. Fort Worth, while it's a major city, is pretty low on the list in terms of flooding hazards compared to other cities across the country. So, but the dollars just weren't there as compared to like an East Coast city.
the city bought the for people are living in those houses, they're renting. How does that work?
They, once the city acquired them, the families or people lived in them moved out. Yeah. They've been vacant since about 2021, 2022.
Find buyers.
Yeah, they last year they hired a local real estate broker to help broker the sale. It was kind of a struggle for our internal staff to sell them. So we brought in somebody from the outside, and that's kind of what made the process go quicker.
Insurance question. Insurance.
Yeah. So I think there's probably 5 or 6 different new property owners. A couple of them bought multiple properties. They are each going to have to decide individually whether they're going to save the house and elevate it or demolish it. And so we aren't quite sure yet what the final outcome is gonna be.
Incentives for buyers. Those kinds
The question was, does the city have incentives for buyers for those houses? I don't think so. I don't remember that being part of the process. I think the value or the price was probably a little reduced just because of all of the external factors that the property owners had to deal with, such as elevation or demolition. I think there was a lot of interest from local developers in demolishing the properties and building new. But even if you build new, you had to build the finished floor out of the floodplain, which is a lot more expensive than building slab on grade, like, you know, a normal construction house in Florida. So, yeah, there may have been a cost savings on purchase, but, you know, but the cost of having to deal with these issues after the properties were acquired is much higher.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first, was there consideration to try to keep people, the original owners with the houses elevated, or was that never considered? And this, yeah.
The question was there any consideration for keeping the original homeowners in their houses? Most of these properties have changed hands over time, many times since they were built in the 1920s. But it was like herding cats, you know. Some people wanted to stay in their homes, and you know that was their forever home when they bought it. Some people were like, I'm gonna take the money and go. And so trying to get everybody on the same page and bought into the same vision. That was one of the other reasons this has been going on for 7 years.
Second question, is there a concern, even if you do raise the houses, that people can be trapped in there when there's 5-foot floods, or like just the landscape becomes so dangerous? How has the landscape itself been considered?
Get back to that. So the Secretary of the Interior, the question was, is there any concern about if the properties were elevated and people would get trapped, or, you know, if landscape would block access to the property once they're elevated? The Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for flood adaptation provide great guidance on accessibility for elevated structures, and also landscape and maintenance. Our stormwater team's big concern was that, you know, people would put in a bunch of landscape borders, which would basically recreate the flooding issues that exist now. And so they were really, they like that there's a lot of visual images on how to hide an elevated structure with landscaping, but also, you know, how to redesign your site to make sure that stormwater was absorbed after the structure was elevated. But I don't think there was any concern about people getting trapped. I mean, it's not like Galveston where you have 20 feet of seawater and rushing into the buildings. So, yeah. Yes.
Ever consider building another retention area on that first lot that was demolished, that way they could take the water next month?
Yes. The question was, did the city ever consider building a retention area on the first lot that could take the stormwater for the next flood? Can I go back? There we go. There's a photo. So you see this right here on the map? That is actually a huge drainage retention basin that was built just upstream. That was completed, I think, in 2016, and it does a great job, but it has not done anything to mitigate any of the flooding on site. And the neighborhood did not want another retention basin like that right next to their homes, because they were afraid of, you know, panhandlers or people hanging out there at all hours of the night. That they ultimately decided not to put that in there. And then, you know, the cost of actually going in and upgrading the storm drain line through this area, which is almost 100 years old now. I think it would have eaten up the entire annual budget for 1 year for the city, for the stormwater division, so. The cost of upgrading all those lines or retention basin was astronomical. Any other questions?